Before we begin, just want to first of all, once again, um, um, thank Susan for her work organizing the dialogue groups, which have been extremely popular recently, and that speaks well. And I want to thank her and all of you for participating in them. So that's it's been a big plus for the community here. Okay, I think we can and before we begin, let me just remind you also that next week is Thanksgiving, and as much as you all want to, we're going to take a week off. And then sadly we actually have to take 2 weeks off. So it's in the schedule. It's been planned for a while. I'll be traveling and giving some talks next, well, the week December 1st. So I won't be able to be here. So we don't meet again until I think December 8th, if I have that correctly.
Yes.
And we'll be reading the Imperialism chapter then. So I look forward to that, and I hope you don't go crazy in our brief interregnum, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Okay. Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and really thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We're continuing to read Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, and we are about halfway through. We're in the middle of the second book called Imperialism, reading the chapter called Race and Bureaucracy. So just to remind where we've come from, the section on imperialism is the middle and I think core section of the book on totalitarianism. Imperialism is this form of government that seeks expansion, that blows past national borders. Thus is going to be connected with the demise of the nation state and all limited political structures. And it is about the elevation of power, the bourgeoisie as the new class in modern society that wants to simply acquire more power, more wealth, more control, and in doing so is willing to bring the state to in a sense harness the state to serve as its army in both domestic and international affairs. And so this idea of imperialism as the constant expansion of power is at the very core of Hannah Arendt's thinking about imperialism as a source of totalitarianism. After this opening chapter on the bourgeoisie and power and imperialism, the next two chapters are on race. The first one, which we read last week, is on race thinking before racism. And the essence of that chapter was to remind us that race, the idea that we're not all one human family, that there's not an idea of humanity, and thus that there's a competition amongst people in this sense of a bourgeois striving after power, means that society is a war of all against all, not only of individuals against individuals, but also of races versus races. And in such an idea, it is only natural that in the competition amongst races, it will lead to a kind of brutality and horrific new forms of governance. That said, she says there in that chapter, there's a difference between race thinking and racism. And that difference is summed up in the line on page 183, where she says there is an abyss between the man of brilliant and facile conceptions and men of brutal deeds. It's one thing to think that you don't like Jews. It's another thing. It's one thing to think that the French are lower than the Germans, or the Germans are higher than the French, as Gobineau did. But it's another thing entirely to say that these differences, these dislikes, these prejudices justify slavery, torture, expulsion, genocide, etc. And so she defines racism, as opposed to simply race thinking, as an ideology that is a political weapon of imperialist politics, namely that racism is what justifies and explains the brutal nature of the subjugation of foreign peoples. Racism is thus a political weapon or an ideology that underlies imperialism. And this is what how she ends chapter 6 on race thinking before race and before racism, where she says that race thinking would have is not the same as racism. However, it was a powerful help to racism, and if it hadn't existed, it would have to be invented by imperialism in order to justify imperialism. And so that is the driving force here. And now in this chapter 7 on race and bureaucracy, she divides it into two parts: race and bureaucracy. All right. Can we mute everyone? I'm sorry. She divides it into two parts: race and bureaucracy. And the point is that these two parts, race and bureaucracy, are both devices for political organization. Race, as a principle of the body politic, she says, is discovered in Africa during the scramble for Africa. What does that mean? It means that race in the scramble for Africa becomes a substitute for the nation. We no longer think of a nation as a group of people within a geographic entity. We begin to think of instead races that, of course, are transnational and imperial, and thus always opposed to national limitation. And race becomes the organizing factor. And so on 185, she writes that race was the emergency explanation of human beings whom no European or civilized man could understand, and whose humanity so frightened and humiliated the immigrants that they no longer cared to belong to the same human species. Now, what's important there's a number of things important to realize here, is that she doesn't think that race in Africa was a race based in skin color. And this is an important and difficult point at times. I'm not saying skin color was completely irrelevant, but she comes to believe that that what really drove the idea of race in this period was that certain peoples seemed to not have a kind of human world. And this applied in her reading as much to the Boers, the Dutch Boers who were in Africa, as it did to the local tribesmen, the African tribesmen. And in this sense, race for her, is not in any way a matter of simple color or religion. It has to do with a way of imagining certain people as subhuman, as not having human qualities. It can get attached to color and religion, and other things, but it is not for her of its essence. And so the one element of the new device of imperial political organization is race instead of nationalism, and that is important because it frees governmental organization or political organization from any kind of national limits. The second is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a principle of foreign domination. The keys to her understanding of bureaucracy is that it's a substitute for government. The administrator rules by reports and in secret. It's an organization in the great game of expansion, where every bureaucratic entity, whether it's Egypt or South Africa or India, is simply a stepping stone in a further game of conquest. So again, connected to the political organization of imperialism. And she says that race and bureaucracy arose independently, one in Africa and one in Asia, but both, she thinks, prove central for the modern emergence of both imperialist rule and totalitarianism. The chapter is divided into three parts. The first is called The Phantom World of the Dark Continent, and it looks primarily at the rise of race. The second part is Gold and Race. It adds to this understanding of race through a kind of metaphorical connection with the discovery of gold, metaphorical and also material connection with the discovery of gold. And then the third is on the imperialist character, which focuses on bureaucracy. In the first part, The Phantom World of the Dark Continent, the key initial insight is that the people who went to Africa were superfluous men. Now, this is a word, a characterization she uses a lot in different ways. What she means here is they weren't the old kind of adventurers, right? They weren't the kind of adventurers who went on their own, looking for adventure and had a kind of nobility to them. These were often prisoners who had been shipped there, or they were people who had been spit out by civilization. They were what she calls, citing Conrad, living abstractions and witnesses of the absurdity of human institutions. They were, in a sense, the scum of the earth, but and they were, as that scum of the earth, hollow to the core. Again, she's quoting here Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. There's a lot to be thought about into what extent it makes sense to make a historical theoretical argument that she's making based on a novel, because there are other sources she uses about South Africa, but clearly The Heart of Darkness is one of the most influential. The point is that these people who were largely the refuse of capitalism, who had very little money and nothing to lose, and they believed in nothing, she thinks are the people who ended up in Africa. And she says, expelled from a world without accepted social values. They had been thrown back upon themselves and still had nothing to fall back upon, except here and there a streak of talent, which made them as dangerous as Kurtz, one of the central characters in Conrad's novel, if they were ever allowed to return to their homelands. They were a game for anything from a pitch and toss to willful murder. So these are the people that she sees as arriving in Africa for the scramble for Africa. And they encountered, again, citing Conrad, the world of native savages. They confronted human beings who did not have political institutions like they were used to, didn't have stories and kind of a human world that they imagined. They were nomads. They were they were in tribes. They weren't in modern political institutions, and thus they were easy to see as inhuman. They were easy to see as prehistoric, and thus a kind of kinship with the inhuman. Again, this is a lot citing Conrad. And so, yet they were also human. And they, when they were encountered by this group called the Boers, who were this sort of small group that had been left in South Africa and grew, the Boers themselves came, she thought, to mimic the tribes in South Africa. They became isolated from European history. They were on bad soil, so they had to have cattle ranches, and they lived far from each other. And so they, in a sense, lived in small clans, and enslaved some of the locals, but basically had no political organization. And anytime they were confronted by the need for politics, they just packed up all their things, left, and trekked out further into the countryside of Africa. And so on 192, she says that what the white Englishmen encountered in South Africa was a fright, not because the people were of a different color than them, but because they seemed to be purely natural human beings who lacked a specifically human character. And she says this was as true of the Boers as it was of the Black South Africans. And that this was a fright of something like oneself that still under no circumstances ought to be like oneself. And this became, she says, the basis for a race society. Racism and a race society emerges in the experience of an encounter with people who are at once like oneself and also so different. And she says that the word race has a precise meaning. This is on page, I think, 187, has a precise meaning only when confronted with a kind of prehistoric group, a group that doesn't have any political or social characteristics that we associate with being human. And they behave like natural beings, not like human beings. And this was, she says, very much what she thought happened in the encounter of this sort of white refuse, these white criminals, these white superfluous men, when they entered into the sort of South African world. Excuse me 1 second. I just realized I'm not getting power into my computer. So she says that race is on 195. She says that racism as a ruling device was used in this society of whites and blacks before imperialism exploited it as a major political idea. Its basis, and of course its excuse, was still experience itself, a horrifying experience of something alien beyond imagination or comprehension. It was tempting indeed simply to declare that these were not human beings. Since, however, despite all ideological explanations, the black men stubbornly insisted on retaining their human features, the white men could not but reconsider their own humanity and decide that they themselves were more than human, and obviously chosen by God to be the gods of black men. This is the encounter of people who she thought seemed inhuman by others, who then elevated themselves up to be like gods. And this encounter is the essence of racism for her. She says that what made the Africans different was not the color of their skin, but the fact that they behaved like a part of nature, that they treated nature as their undisputed master, and they had not created a human world. Now, I'll just be clear, and I'm sure this will come up in the question and answer. There's a lot of people who look at this and say, oh my God, she has this very, how would we call it? European or Western bias against the Africans, and she saw them this way. And, it's very possible that that's correct. I think what's important to understand is she's here talking about the way the white superfluous men encountered and engaged the Africans, and so she's trying to understand their perspective and how she's trying to understand how the idea of racism as a political weapon in the name of ideology emerged. And so she's trying to understand the way the people who invented racism encountered the idea of race in Africa. And that's the argument that's being made here. It's actually quite similar to her attempt in the book Eichmann in Jerusalem to understand Eichmann, to understand what it is that led someone who seemed like a regular bourgeois working person to end up being a genocidal murderer. There's a kind of empathy in the sense of trying to understand it from their perspective. And that's what's going on here in this chapter. It's not an excuse, it's just an attempt to understand what she's doing. What all of this leads to is that rootlessness, she believes, is characteristic of all race organizations, as she says on 196. So that race turns people into a horde. Not only the Black Africans, but also the white racists, the Boers. She thinks they turned into a kind of non-political, non-national, racial horde. And thus, both the racists and the people who have been raced are characterized by rootlessness. The Boers, she says, were emancipated from work. They have a complete lack of a humanly built world. They abandon their property and trekked in the woods. All of this is an example that they are rootless and they are tribal. And so this rootlessness, she believes, is characteristic of, I said, all race organizations. And out of a hate of the world, racism can imagine its destruction. I think that's a really important insight that she's offering here, that it's not only the people that the Boers are racist against, but it's the Boers themselves that turn into nihilists, that come out of a deep hatred of the world. They hated the world, the Boers did, and they had no use for institutions of the world. And I think it's fascinating to look, again, this is just a quick little bonus that we can come back to in questions and Q&A. But if you look at both on the right and the left today, whether it's the sort of racial elements of the Trump MAGA movement, which is not the whole Trump MAGA movement, but the racial elements of it, there's a hatred of institutions, a desire to tear it all down. There's a kind of rootlessness in it. Similarly, I think on the ideological left, there is a rootlessness. There's a desire to tear all the institutions down, a hatred of power, a hatred of anyone who's in power. And these are both what I would call race institutions in Arendt's terms. So on 196 to 197, she can say the point is that no matter whether racism appears as the natural result of catastrophe, it is always closely tied to contempt for labor, hatred of territorial limitations, general rootlessness, and an atavistic faith in one's own divine chosenness. And so that's how she imagines rootlessness and race as it emerges in the scramble for Africa. The second part on gold and race, is a fascinating inquiry into a number of questions, including the economic foundations of this, the way that imperialism abandons capitalism and the idea of profit, the way that mob leaders in Africa, like Karl Peters, just simply decided that they wanted to be, these were the scum of the earth in her view, and they decided they wanted to become a master race, and they simply declared themselves a master race. And she says this was, in a way, the model for the Nazis. There's also a very interesting section in this section on race and gold on the Jews who were not the main imperialists here, didn't own much, but they were the financiers of it. And the way in which the Jews were driven into the center of this race society and singled out by the Boers from all other white people for special hatred. So even though the Jews were there as financial instruments of Europeans, they became racialized deeply and quickly by the Boers. The third and last section of this chapter is bureaucracy and the imperialist character. And she says, if race was discovered in South Africa, bureaucracy was discovered in Egypt, Algeria, and India. The point she wants to make here, and I think this is one of the more interesting chapters or sections of the book, is that race is an escape into irresponsibility from human worldliness and having a home. Race is an escape into rootlessness. It's an escape from the fellowship of man. Bureaucracy, however, is the opposite. Bureaucracy is a taking up of a responsibility that no man can bear for another to rule an inferior. And this is really important for us to understand and to think about. Bureaucracy, the rule by experts, the rule by offices, bureaus, offices, the rule by reports, is the way we rule over inferiors. And she's going to look at it here within the context, obviously, of imperialism. But you can't today, in the 21st century, read this and not think about all the different populist revolts against expert bureaucratic rule, whether it's in the EU or the United States or the UN or corporations. There is a real feeling today that people are losing or being ruled by experts who think of them as inferiors, as deplorables, or whatever you want to think of it. And Arendt's analysis of the rule of bureaucracy as a taking responsibility for others who we think of, or who the bureaucrats think of as inferior to them, is a powerful analysis and indictment of a lot of modern ideas of government, to the extent that she sees bureaucracy as a substitution for and an attack on Republican or democratic self-rule. This is an important chapter in her larger political thinking as well. She says that on 207, she says bureaucracy is a consequence of that administration by which Europeans had tried to rule foreign peoples whom they felt to be hopelessly their inferiors and at the same time in need of their special protection. It was the result of a responsibility that no man can bear for his fellow men and no people for another people. There are a couple of models of the bureaucrat that she talks about here. One is the importance of legends, the white man's burden, and the example here is Rudyard Kipling. The idea that these bureaucrats come over from England or Europe to India or Egypt and rule for the good of the natives. And she says whether this is either hypocrisy or racism doesn't matter. It didn't prevent many of the best Englishmen from shouldering this burden, right? It is hypocrisy and racism, or one of the two, or both, but still there were many that had these ideals, and they attract many of the best men who actually try and rule in the best interest. One of those men is someone she calls Lord Cromer. or not calls, who identifies as Lord Cromer, who ruled as a bureaucrat in Egypt, and started out as one of these young idealists, but by the end of his many-year rule, she thinks had become another form of bureaucrat, a much more dangerous type. And he writes an essay or a pamphlet on the philosophy of bureaucratic rule, and she identifies 6 characteristics of bureaucracy that I think are really exceptionally interesting and important, both in the analysis here, but also in our thinking about government today. The first is that the bureaucrat is led by a sense of sacrifice for backward populations and a sense of the duty to the glory of Great Britain. So it gives birth to a class of officials who have the desire and capacity to govern. And I think you see that still in many examples of bureaucracy. I mean, just again, an aside, but one I think is very important. When in the first impeachment trial a few years ago of Donald Trump, or President Trump, one of the great moments was when a number of bureaucrats came out and testified about their doing their duty, and they're trying to lead a bureaucratic world that was above politics and that was seen as doing a sacrifice, a service to the country. And this is the first element of bureaucracy. The second is that it offers, the bureaucrat acts with personal influence without legal treaty. The idea being that because the bureaucrat rules a foreign population, they have a lot of personal authority, and they're often given the authority whether to act or not. Now we think, oh no, the bureaucrat has to follow rules, but the bureaucrat has an enormous amount of discretion about which rules to follow and how so, and that personal influence is a second part. The third is that the bureaucrat can alter their rule at a moment's need. The whole point of a bureaucrat is that they can they're trusted to deal with crises and deal with what happens, and sometimes have to rule without law. And the fourth is that they require highly trained staff who renounce ambition. The point is they're doing this for the good of the system. The fifth is a passion for secrecy. They like to stand behind the signs. They don't like to be seen. They're not elected. They don't have to govern. They don't have to campaign. They are the people who run things behind the scenes, what people today derogatorily call the deep state. And sixth, what the bureaucrat gets in return is power. He can do what he will and what he needs. It's a government of experts. And this bureaucracy, she says, is always a government of experts, of an experienced minority, which has to resist as well as it knows how the constant pressure from the inexperienced majority. That's on page 214. In this sense, bureaucrats on 215, she says, are the instruments of incomparable value in the execution of a policy of imperialism, because they degrade men, the bureaucrats, into mere instruments. The bureaucrats become instruments, but they become instruments in a kind of government of experts that executes a policy of imperialism without regard to legal limits and without regard to moral limits. And so at the basis of bureaucracy as a form of government and of inherent replacement of law with temporary changing decrees lies, she says on page 216, this superstition of a possible and magic identification of man with the forces of history. And this is the key thing. The bureaucrat acts outside of law in secret. And the bureaucrat thus can govern in accordance with the trends of the time, the forces of history. They can, like, and here she gives an example that the bureaucrat is sort of like the secret agent who operates in the dark, behind the scenes. And the example here is Lawrence of Arabia, who started again with great boyhood ideals as an adventurer, but eventually gave himself over to being simply a pawn in the great game run by the British Secret Service. And when when Lawrence of Arabia tries to understand this at the end of his life back in England, he understands that what made him effective was simply that he allowed himself to be a force that helped push the way that the British were pushing him, that he pushed the right way. And he says, I'm still puzzled as to how far the individual counts. A lot, I fancy, if he pushes the right way. The point is, he becomes part of the secret forces of history. And because he works in secret as a secret agent or as a bureaucrat, this bureaucrat subordinates themselves to, secret forces, the rise of imperialism, the rise of capitalism, the rise of socialism, the rise of Nazism. The bureaucrat is a functionary who believes that he is part of a system that is pushing the right way. So if you believe you're part of a communist bureaucracy that is in the end doing justice, you can operate outside the laws in order to push it in that direction, even if it might mean breaking a few eggs to make an omelet. I think there's an analogy today with those who are involved in what we might call the ideology of identity politics or DEI, who are willing to be bureaucrats, push the right way, have maybe there's some injustices, but overall we're making society a more just society. And this kind of bureaucrat who subordinates their individuality and individual decisions to a kind of become a functionary in the advance of an ideological system, a political ideological system, is what Arendt here thinks of as the combination of race and bureaucracy. Race is what creates, justifies the bureaucratic rule of experts over inferiors, of bureaucrats over subject populations. And that's the way that imperialism, racism, and bureaucracy are tied together in these first three chapters of this book on imperialism. All right, I'll stop there and say I hope this is an interesting chapter. I find these chapters to be some of the richest in her work and in the book. Please be respectful in the chat. You can, again, attack people's ideas, but not people themselves. And I look forward to the conversation. If you want to participate in the conversation, please go down to the reactions button and raise your hand. Looks like we have lots of opportunity to talk today. So please join in. The first is Zoom user. I don't know who that is. I can't see, but welcome, Zoom user.
I think that may be me, Roger.
Yes, I can't see who that is. It's very small.
Bob Meyerson.
Oh, hi, Bob. Hi.
Hi. Thank you. You touched on this, but I guess I'd like a little more clarification. I'm trying to understand Arendt's voice, and it's not only here in Origins, but of course it's in Eichmann and probably other places as well. But she uses the term savage in a number of places, but one of the worst citations here is on page 186 toward the bottom, where she says colonization took place in America and Australia, the two continents that, and here it is, without a culture and a history of their own, had fallen into the hands of Europeans.
Yep.
So either this is incredibly ignorant, or else she's channeling what she thinks is the European reaction, especially South America, but also Australia. So which is it? Ignorance or channeling?
Maybe a little of both. But I also, I think So what I would say is, just like, she makes an effort to understand people, we have to make an effort to understand her, right? And my guess is, if you were to say to her, well, of course there were civilizations in America and Australia, and they had traditions, and they had ways of life, and how can you say that the two continents without a culture and a history of their own existed? Isn't that racist? I'm not Hannah Arendt, and I hazard ever to speak for her, but what I think, if I try and understand what she's saying, it would be that, of course, there were people there. Of course, they're humans. And of course, they have a kind of a life and culture. I think what she wants to say is that they didn't have a political culture in the way she thinks of it. These were people who moved around, somewhat nomadic. Now, obviously, the Mayan civilization and the Incan civilization could be exceptions to that, and I think she would certainly recognize that. But there was certainly no general political culture that had created a historical legend and historical sense of continuity. There were this is complicated, and I think there's differences. I think there were probably some I've read a lot about tribal histories in the last 2 years, and I think some tribes were more had more of a sense of coherence, and others more were emerged and then fought and disappeared, and were less connected to a kind of common story over time. But yeah, I think there's a certain ignorance here on her part, but I also think the argument she's making is not one that's saying these people didn't deserve recognition. I think what she's trying to say is they weren't seen as, and they weren't experienced as people who created what we would call, or what Europeans would call, humanly meaningful worlds. Now, there's a way in which that's simply wrong, right? One of the things that a lot of European observers, including Ben Franklin and others, came to see is that when Americans were captured by Native American tribes, or went and lived amongst them, they often didn't want to come back, and they found it to be more meaningful and more free and better. And I think that's a fascinating insight and argument that could be brought up to and marshaled to complicate or change her reading. So, and I don't think she would in any way oppose that. All she's trying to do here is understand the emergence of racism and race as an idea. And so if you want to understand the emergence of race as an idea, she says you have to understand that it emerged in the experience of a confrontation with people who appeared to be human and yet inhuman at the same time. And that's her argument. I don't think this is an effort to do an anthropology or an understanding of tribal cultures. And I think if she were to do so, she would come up with and do it in a very different way. But none of that's to say that, so I don't think it's offensive. I don't think, oh my God, this and that. I think she's doing something particular. The question is, does this lack of seeing the fact that there were cultures in Africa, Australia, and America, does it change her argument? Does it impact her argument? And I would say no, but that doesn't, but that's, I'm happy to, hear where people would disagree. So, I mean, if there are people who read this looking for outrage, right? And this, there's many sentences in here. This Bob read one of them. Colonization took place where people had no culture. And they say, oh, so Arendt's a racist. Again, I'm not interested in those kind of gotcha kind of things. But I don't think that's right. I think what it shows is she's looking at this and trying to understand in the context in which this encounter happened, how the imagination of race emerged. And so I take that for what it's worth. I don't know if that helps, Bob, or not.
Yes, it does. So you're falling on the side of channeling. The only thing I would add is that if you look at this from the point of view of the cultures and the indigenous people of the Americas, vis-a-vis the Spanish and the other conquerors, it's the Europeans who appear as savages, people without culture, people without morality.
Yeah, I mean, I as I said, I mean, one of the interesting things to read is a lot of these accounts of Europeans who go to live with natives and Native Americans, especially, is most of what I've come across, and end up wanting to stay. And when people try and recapture them and bring them back, they say, no, I want to stay. It's better here. And there's a way in which there is an openness at that time to seeing the Native American culture as superior, more free, more human than the European culture, that gets quashed by the power of European culture. And I think again, Arendt doesn't write about that. What she would say about it is, only a guess on my part. My guess is she would find it compelling and fascinating. I think there is a sense in her work that to be political, you need to create enduring institutions that have authority and also allow for freedom. And whether she didn't know that about the people in Australia, America, and Africa, whether she was right or wrong about it, I don't think she was focused on it that much. Let's just put it that way. But I think you're right that she's not making an effort to humanize them. That said, if you look at what she writes about the African experience, which is what she's really focused on, what she says is the Boers elevated themselves up as, the godlike master race, but it was actually the Black African slaves who became more human because they were the ones who did the work and thus were connected to the institutions of society, and they became more rooted and grounded in the land than the quote unquote racist masters. And so she says, in many ways, the slaves became more politically connected to their culture than the racist masters, and thus more human. You know, whether this analysis of hers is one that one can do a lot with or make with, I don't know. I've, you know, I don't know what it means to talk about slaves as more human than their masters. I mean, I think it's an interesting, you know, I mean, it's an insight she has. Yeah, I mean, again, I look at this chapter, you know, you say channeling versus, I don't know what the other word you used was, but, you know, and what I say is, for the most part, look, these chapters are trying to do something, and we should understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to talk about the beginning of racism and the idea of not race thinking, which has an earlier emergence, but actual ideological, politically motivated racism. And she says that that idea has its emergence in an encounter of people in which one side is seen as inhuman in the sense of being like nature and caught up in nature. Whether that's true or not, I think is irrelevant to her argument. And I don't think she's caught up in the question of whether it's true or not. And so that's how I read it.
Okay, thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Bob. Robert. Oh, Rachel. I'm sorry. I'm having trouble reading the screen today. I apologize.
I wanted to defend Arendt a little bit on this point that we're going back and forth on, and it seems that there are passages in Imperialism that suggest that slightly different than what you're suggesting about nature not being at an issue for her, and that is at the end of the discussion of the decline of the nation state and the rights of man, where she's talking about the failure of the conceptualization of human rights in a meaningful sense. She makes this comment about the civilized men who the more civilized they are, the more they are going to resent the people who are living, closer to nature. And she explicitly says, and those people who are living closer to nature might be very much the educated among their own people. And so there, by referring to the people who live in close to nature as being educated, I think she's explicitly affirming that they do have a culture and world. And then she makes the point that, it's the farther away you are from nature in the so-called civilization, the more you are going to resent the people who are living with nature. And I think that gets to the horror that she describes via Conrad, that thing that this fear of the nature within themselves that caused them to freak out and, commit genocide because of their own, psychological alienation from their own kind of animal being. And I think that continues in her description of world alienation in the human condition, where she defines it as not being willing to share the earth with the other species, that you would somehow need to transcend and not be human in an animal sense. And so I think that's a very a strong defense of that. And I think it's where it's this kind of open point where she's describing the need to reconceptualize human rights in a way that, and I think she even says that the most fundamental thing would be to understand human rights in terms of the things we take most for granted, which if you think about how we're confronted by technology, like the human rights not to be dictated by the machine, the human right to be able to live with nature, to not be alienated in a certain way. I think she's actually going in that direction, which would be very consistent with a critique of technology or the degree to which technology dictates to us. And that, if we just think about what it means to have the human right to have a right, or to, as she puts it, to have an opinion that counts for something, that could be defined even in a world with slavery. You might be a slave in a different culture and have more of an opinion in your own context than you do in a technological world where you're censored or canceled through technology.
Rachel, thank you. These are good points. Rachel's talking about these passages on page 300 to 301 near the end of the imperialism section. And they do tie into what Bob is asking about, but in, I think, a difficult way. What she says is that in the more highly developed civilization, the more at home men feel with the human artifice, the more they will resent everything they have not produced, everything that is merely and mysteriously given to them. The human being who has lost his place in a community, his political status, and the struggle of his time, and the legal personality which makes his actions and part of his destiny a consistent whole, is left with those qualities which usually become articulate only in the sphere of private life, mere existence. So there's a number of things to say about that, right? But one is that she is here reasserting the kind of biases that I think Bob is putting into question, right? She has a bias for a political life in which we gather together and talk to each other and build common enduring institutions. She has this bias because her idea of freedom is freedom to act together, to build things in a human way, right?
But isn't it important to emphasize that she also is where she critiques the liberal theory of power and the imposition of, top-down solutions onto other peoples? She explicitly says that what's missing is, basically the white men's ability to let people, figure out their own destiny.
Yeah.
And she,
Right.
everyone should be able to have their own state and create it the way they want. And that she really takes a strong standpoint for pluralism in terms of, even the form of the state that's created. And that seems to be also on the emphasis of acknowledging that people, should have the right to, determine their own culture.
Absolutely. All I was trying to say is that there's a prejudice in her work, which is pluralistic, but is a prejudice for political organization that is based in a kind of collective action and self-government. And that's a prejudice. And thus she, worries that in liberalism, to the extent people retreat from the bourgeois retreat from political action, will mean that they feel they retreat into a kind of private life and become almost inhuman. She thinks sort of the bourgeois, she has real contempt for the bourgeoisie, as you've already seen in chapter 5, and is evident throughout this book and also in many of her other books as well. And that contempt for the bourgeoisie who lives a kind of private life is not that different from her contempt for the native tribes. And here's where, I think Bob is both right and wrong. I mean, I think he's right in that it's not just channeling. She does have a kind of disdain / contempt for the native tribes, but it's not a racial one, and it's not one that is based in the fact that they're of a certain race or time or place, because I mean, she has the same contempt for the Boers and she has the same contempt for the bourgeoisie. It's an argument that all of these different groups don't engage in what she would call human politics as she understands it. Now, she certainly doesn't condone or support the dehumanization of these people through racism or bureaucracy. And even in this passage on page 301, she says, we have to, even with these people who are, in a sense, the bourgeoisie who are dehumanized, we have to learn to love them for who they are and let them be, right? And she would say the same thing about the Native Americans or people in Australia or people in Africa, but also the bourgeoisie and even to some extent the Boers. You have to let people be as they are. And so there is a pluralism in her work, and yet there's definitely a kind of prejudice for human governance that one can't deny. And so, while a lot of people have looked at these Native American tribes and said they're more free than others, she might say, well, yes, but not freedom in the sense of collective action.
That doesn't really make that much sense to me, because having read a lot of Tocqueville and say Tacitus, which I think she would probably line up with, there was that notion of the noble savage, like Tocqueville described the indigenous people as very close to the feudalism, to European feudalism, and they had their legends and their warriors. And I think that her notion of human action historically sees plenty of dignity in what we would call feudalism, and there would be action and stories and memory and history. And so if I don't see why we would expect that she would view it differently than Tocqueville did.
Well, I think she would. First of all, I don't think she knew that much about it. Secondly, I don't think she thinks of feudalism as a meaningful political society. It's for her, political society has to also be one of equality, and one where everybody, all people in it can, in a public sphere, partake politically in the life of the people. And to the extent that doesn't happen or is not allowed, she wouldn't think of that as a political society.
But we wouldn't necessarily say it was contemptuous. I guess I would just say that the fact that she describes the people who are living closer to nature as having, could be very educated and they have their legends. So I'll stop, but I just.
Okay, but Rachel, I mean, you have to deal with the fact that Bob is right. I mean, she is in these sections. She is somewhat contemptuous. Again, I don't think it's a contempt that is meaningful in the sense that that she's trying. That I think it's somewhat of it's part of a larger argument, and it's fitting into her argument, and I don't think she's engaging with it deeply. And so what I would say is, to make a lot of it, I find unhelpful, because I think there are other places in her work where you can find her engaged in different ways. But there's no doubt that she in these passages does speak of whatever you want to call it, savage or primitive or native peoples, in ways that are lacking in humanity. Now, again, I don't think she is saying, oh, they're lacking humanity, therefore they're inhuman and therefore we should be racist. That's not her claim at all. But she is saying that there's a way in which they struck the Europeans that way. And there's a way in which she thinks that makes sense. And I don't see that as problematic. I think it's just what she's saying.
Okay, I just go on the channeling. I put my vote for channeling. That's all.
Okay.
And Roger, let me just for a moment. This is Bill. I'm jumping ahead of the line because I think that everyone is meeting the book at a very high level. It is a damn hard read for a person of color right now, because I don't think that she is ever writing to me. I don't think that, I understand that she's a German Jewish woman of a certain generation, but the project of us being in this reading group and reading this quote great book is put into question when you realize that there is a tone deafness at the heart of some of the analysis. But that's all I would say. It is, and I know that like I've said this to you before, this book was published in 52. Did anyone, 51? Did anyone ever, anyone at the New Yorker, or any of her circle ever talk about the language in the book and the way that we are now? And I find that kind of shocking. Yeah, the book is of use, but there's something that I really have to struggle with when I have to take her at face value, and more than that, take her into my head and heart. So enough said. I don't even know what I'm saying right now is that I just think that we all got to take a breath and say that we're looking at something that is kind of awesome, because Hannah was a product of the very thing that she is critiquing. And she's smart, but she missed some things. And there seemed to be nobody around her at that time who would say, hey, girlfriend, have you thought about this, what you're saying here and how you're saying it? That's all. I apologize for jumping the line, but this is, it's very difficult read for some of us who are people of color.
Yeah, look, all I can say is I am not committed to strongly, I'm not interested in attacking her or defending her on the questions of, the language, right? I hear what Bill and Bob are saying, right? Which is that the language is difficult and off-putting, and maybe worse than that. I hear what Rachel's saying, which is that it's channeling and this and that. I think that there's a legitimate argument on both sides there. And if someone says, look, the language is off-putting to me and I can't read it, I hear that too. All I can say is, what I've tried to say and what I think is important is that if you can move beyond this question, what she's saying about racism and bureaucracy are incredibly smart and brilliant and helpful in understanding both the origins of totalitarianism, the emergence of imperialism, the emergence of racism, and so much of our politics today. So none of that is to, I'm not here saying we should excuse every use of every word. And I think Bill's absolutely right. She didn't, I think she used words in ways that she didn't realize sometimes the way they would be read 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 years later. Even in the very beginning of the chapter, at the footnote, where she says, an even worse case, of course, is that of Leopold II of Belgium, responsible for the blackest pages in the history of Africa, right? Where she's criticizing Leopold for his racism, but uses the word blackest pages, obviously, in her mind as a kind of colorful a metaphor of sorts. And yet, I think today we read these things differently than she would have.
Roger, did she know Black historians? She never cites any Black people. I'm reading this with somebody recently who was not a fan, and I'm trying to make him a fan. He said, well, hey man, what is this? There's Black people are subject. They are not really, I know it sounds like, you know, the knee-jerk era of everybody wants to be, their identity to be made center, but there is something problematic in a text like this, that she could not find a Black intellectual to quote.
Yeah. So
she could not. They didn't exist.
Well, first of all, you're right. I mean, we've talked about this in other reading groups. I mean, I think it really wasn't until she read James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time in the New Yorker that she began engaging with Black writers, right? So let's just say that's not until, I forget the exact date, but you know, at least 17 or 18 years after this, if not more. And so you know, let's stipulate that there is a lacunae in her intellectual firmament around Black writers and Black intellectuals. You know, I don't know, and I say this in utter innocence, I don't know how many Black intellectuals were writing about the beginnings of imperialism in the 1940s. My guess is not that many, but again, I don't know. I think she read, I think she read the main texts on imperialism that were in existence at the time. I will say this, I mean, she's incredibly clear-sighted about the racism of Europe and of the Belgians. I mean, you know, I think compared to most people who wrote on this at this time, you know, you're talking about someone who is much more clear-sighted about the utter inhumanity and racism of the period. But she's relying on European, and you know, Conrad is a big part of it. I mean, yes, she's not reading Black historians. I'm not sure who was there. I'm not sure who she was supposed to have read. But which isn't an excuse. It's just saying, I think you're right. I don't think that takes away from the power of her argument, right? I mean, again, this is one of those situations where instead of saying, oh, you didn't cite this or you're this, look at the argument, right? I guess what I want to say, Bill, and to everyone, and Bob, is the argument to me is powerful. I'm happy to have people say, you know, we can make the argument better, or I could critique the argument. I acknowledge that some of the language is language that today people find maybe rightly problematic. But to me, that's not the core of why I read her text. And I think what's important for me is to try and make sense of the argument, and to simply say, oh, well, she didn't cite Black historians. I don't know. I mean,
no, you sense that she didn't have a Black audience, and she did not know how to have a Black audience. And poor thing, most white writers of the time didn't know that.
Yeah,
so
I think that,
I got it. Cut her some slack, acknowledge that she's brilliant, and let's move on. I would challenge you and people on this phone call, if she handled issues, language around Judaism in another context, in the way she's handled this language, I think that the conversation would grind to a halt.
well, no, because I think there's a lot of people, Bill, who say that she does the same thing. I mean, she talks about, you know, East European Jews, and sometimes does it in very kinds of similar language to what she's talking about here about, you know, tribes in Africa and also in America or Australia. So I think you're absolutely right. She comes at this with in talking about Jews, but also talking about Blacks and Native Americans, you know, or Native Australians, in a kind of with prejudices of her times. I have no problem criticizing her for that. And I'm not trying to say, I think it's wrong to say, I'm saying cut her some slack and move on. That's not my point, or at least not what I hope is my point. My point is, I'm happy to, you know, if people, I'm happy to get into those conversations. We're in one right now, but I guess what I'm more interested in is not move on, but there's actually an argument here that is worth considering, that I think she's made, that I'm trying to bring out, that I think is actually helpful for people today in 2023 who want to talk about race, or want to talk about imperialism, or want to talk about bureaucracy. And I think there's very few people of any race or any color or any time period who've written about it with as much insight as she has. And while the language can be off-putting, the arguments need to be taken seriously for what they are. That's my argument.
No, and you've stated it many times, and please, I don't know, I cannot stop. I don't want to. I'm trying to get to what the point of the book is as well. I want to get past this, because this book is supposed to be helping me understand the bigger question right now is how we come into a world that's ever more authoritarian or totalitarian. So that's what I say, cut her some slack, move on, know how to read Hannah Arendt as a Black person, take a breath. There will be times when it will feel like you're ignorant, not ignorant, you're invisible. But that's a lot of the experience of what we've learned about publishing and so on. Was a figure some years ago I read, 95% of everything that was published is really for white audiences. That's just the truth.
I think that's a fair, I think that's a completely fair comment. And
maybe, but irrelevant in the terms of what your goal is here. Let's listen to the woman's argument and see if we can move on. So thank you for the indulgence. I think that I because of my Black skin, I am not able to be neutral. Now that's my problem, right? I should be able to be neutral. And that is always the challenge in my art world and in the world right now. If you want to play with the big boys and girls and intellectual, you've got to get out of your race. You've got to get out of your sexuality. You got to put all that aside and let's just deal with the argument, which is good. It's a good exercise.
yeah.
Thank you, Roger.
Thanks, Bill.
Great job. Thank you very much.
By the way, for those who haven't seen it, Bill's new show, Night Watch, down at the Perlman Center is fantastic. And I highly recommend it to anyone who has the chance to see it in New York. Who's next? Is this Zoom user? Is this Bob again, or is it someone else? All right, Stephen, you're up next.
Hi, Roger. Thanks for this series. I'm a newcomer to this group. I'm way behind in my reading, but I did want to jump in with some important questions that I think you're addressing even in this chapter. I think, and forgive me, this on my limited understanding of the text at this point. I'm concerned about the lack of an investigation into the human nature of these issues, and whether or not there's any people that has not at some point in history been subjugated. I mean, we could look at the 13th century and the Mongol hordes, you used the word earlier, as an example, or the Chinese civilization that tried to protect itself from the Mongol hordes as well. So, but I'm going to give a pointed question with regard to her vision of having political society that allows the individuals to engage in dialogue. And it's a question that comes out of Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. It's a very, very simple question. I'd like to find out your take on how you think Arendt might answer this question. And I think it's a very timely question with regard to what's going on in the Middle East. Here's the question. How do tolerant people tolerate intolerance or intolerant
people? How do tolerant people tolerate intolerant people?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, it's a big question. I mean, I'm not sure that's a topic related right now in this chapters. But it's one of the classic questions of liberalism, right? If liberalism is supposed to balance liberty or freedom and order, you want to have maximum amount of freedom without sacrificing order. And if you take John Stuart Mill's, the harm principle, the idea is that you can exercise your freedom and do whatever you want, and so long as you don't illegally interfere with the freedom of others.
Sure, that's a classical definition of what a classic liberalism is about, and I totally agree with that. But the question becomes, in Arendt's view of things, if she doesn't deal with human nature, in other words, if it's part of our nature to struggle with one another and have different civilizations competing, that's the word that you used earlier, competing with and trying to protect the civilization that they believe upholds the values of our humanity. If she's not going to deal with that nature, because we're always going to be chasing our tail. So if you looked at the First World War, the Germans actually believed that they were upholding humanity and trying to defend their culture. And they felt that barbarians were at the gates. And that, I think, is what we're seeing right now with the West and the Islamic world. So there is
Stephen, I'm not really sure where the question is coming from in this book, but what I can say is this: she thinks there are that since at the very core of what it means to be human is to accept plurality. She thinks that those who seek to eliminate plurality from the world go against what she would call a fundamental law of humanity. And so those who try and extinguish a particular race or enslave a particular race, those who use racism not just as a matter of thinking but for brutal deeds, are for her people who need to be resisted, punished, or even killed, as she says.
So I guess that's the nature of my question. My
Okay,
question, that's intolerant. What you just defined was intolerance.
I guess the answer is she's tolerant of opinions. She's not intolerant of mass murder. And if you want to say that's intolerant, I would say, yes, you're right. And she is intolerant and I'm intolerant. I mean, I'm not someone who thinks that we have to tolerate mass murder. I don't know if that's a controversial opinion, but it's certainly mine.
Well, in light of October 7th, I think it's very topical.
Well, I mean, I agree. I mean, I don't think I countenance mass murder. I think people who engage in mass murder should be judged and punished for it. And I have no hesitancy in saying that.
I think you put your finger on it by saying judgment. So this is the dilemma that we all face, is judging which side has the moral high ground. And I
mean, you don't have to judge that. I mean, you can, if you want. You can say that, what Hamas did is clearly an act of mass murder and should be judged and punished. We can look at what Israel's doing, and people can make judgments about that. I think it's, I think there's it's a little bit more complicated and nuanced, and yet I think that there's clearly, I think there are things that are being done that a lot of people have judged to be beyond the pale, and some that I think are more nuanced and difficult. But you don't have to sit there, and I don't think the goal is to say one side is more or better than the other. And I know that in popular discourse that's the goal, but that's not my goal.
And let me be clear, that's not my goal either. I think what Hannah Arendt is doing is asking us to think on a very deep level. And
I
at
agree.
certain points, our positions will be not in line with certain sides of this debate, but to think through those paradoxes. And I think that's why we have to deal with the human nature of the circumstances.
I agree.
Anyway, I wanted to engage with you on that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Ken.
Yeah, I know there's just a few minutes left. I'm so enjoying reading this book after reading her other books and coming back to it. I think, I read those sentences that Bob brought up over and over again, trying to place them. And I don't think she would want us to not be outraged by those sentences. I think what we're trying to do is, understand that abyss that you brought up to begin with. Like, we're crossing with her from facile conceptions to bestial deeds, right? What'd she say? Brutal deeds and active bestiality. And she uses language very differently in all of her books. I actually feel like she's very consistent in how she defines things, but she's always looking at things from a different perspective, almost like she's turning around her hand, looking over it. And in this book, almost all of the language, all the perspectives are taking us on this trip across that abyss, of to bestiality. And I mean, I could tie it, I kind of wanted to tie it back to anti-Semitism in the beginning of the book, just talking about the book in very general terms. That whole first chapter of anti-Semitism goes from the humanity of people, basically, that we can dislike each other, we can hate each other, we can hate Jews based on what they do, based on, say, Judaism, whatever, because we light candles or whatever we do, or we're bankers. That whole chapter drifts to the internal, not to just what they do, to what they are. So like that difference between crime and vice was very important. That it was, crime is something we do and we could be punished for. Vice is something that's inherent. And then it goes further than that to something we didn't do. So to the Dreyfus affair, he didn't do anything, right? He was maybe too high up and he was a Jew. So that was really about Jew hatred. And that chapter seemed really important in that to end, I mean, the Dreyfus affair seemed really important to end of that chapter in that it didn't become instrumentalized. So it was an instance of Jew hatred, but it didn't become militarized. And now we're getting in imperialism into the part where racism is becoming instrumentalized. And I find it extremely upsetting and also just really interesting. And some of it in terms of what's going on in the United States. One sentence I wanted to return to in particular on page 206 was that South Africa's race society taught the mob the great lesson of which it had always had a confused premonition, that through sheer violence, an underprivileged group could create a class lower than itself. And that for this purpose, it did not even need a revolution, but could band together with groups of the ruling classes. That seems like something I thought that the Nazis also learned from the United States, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
she seems to stay away from the United States in this, which is maybe a question I have.
You have to remember, first of all, she wrote much of this book, well, in the early 1940s, when she had just come to the United States. And I don't think she knew much about the United States. She was largely a European thinker. But, and I think this fits with some of what Bill was saying as well, right? Which is, her writing and her reference or points of reference are still European. I mean, most of the sources are European.
Mhm.
And she's not, and it's certainly not, Black writers or an intellectual tradition. I mean, to the extent that there were writers on this topic, I don't know. There may have been, but I just don't know. And she certainly doesn't cite them. So she's very much in a frame. But I think, Ken, it's important to end with this, because I think you brought us back to what I think is important here, right? The argument is that race does emerge in Africa in this idea that a class of people, even a lower class of people, can emerge as a mob, in which through sheer violence, they can create another group even lower than themselves. And they can do so for political reasons, namely, not ultimately for racial reasons, right? I mean, and I think this is like one of the most important points. I mean, today, more and more African-American writers are making the same point. Ibram Kendi makes this point, and many others. Kenan Malik makes this point very clearly in his recent work, and I just had a conversation with him about this at the Arendt Center a couple of weeks ago, that race doesn't begin in hatred. It begins in justification of political acts. And that's what she's saying here. What the next chapter, right, on the pan movements, which we'll read in our next reading group, which is in 2 weeks, is going to argue that the anti-Semitic pan movements, the pan-German, pan-Slavic movements in Europe, take this idea of racism that emerges in Africa and applies it to European imperialist movements, and that it switches the group that is sought to be argued against from African groups or native Indian groups in India or Egypt to Jews. And they take this invention that invented in Africa and begin to apply it on the continent, where the group they applied against is Jews. If you understand the breadth of this argument, I think you realize the power of this book, and how it's trying to really look very deeply to understand the rise of totalitarianism in Germany and the Soviet Union. And I think that's a powerful and worthwhile inquiry. We've gone over a bit. I apologize to keeping you guys, but thank you all very much. Have a very happy Thanksgiving, and I'm sorry I won't see you for 2 weeks, but I look forward to seeing you when we do reconvene and reading the Pan Movements chapter, which is really where she begins now to take us from this kind of 3-chapter deviation right into imperialism in Africa, in India, in Egypt, and bring us back to 20th century Europe and the rise of anti-national imperialist movements that take the idea of racism and transpose it into anti-Semitism and use that as a political weapon for their own imperialist political aims. And that's what we'll be talking about in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks, I guess. Thank you all very much. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.